Okay, so welcome to our brief study session for the final exam in our ethics class, which will be covering Unit 3, Chapters 3 and 10. So the exam will be made up of short essay questions, and we're just going to do a quick overview of the questions. Starting with the Chapter 3 questions. Number 1, describe the 4 major approaches to moral differences outlined at the beginning of Chapter 3. Which one comes closest to your own viewpoint? Explain. So in 1 to 2 solid paragraphs, you are expected to address all of the components of these questions. So remember, don't just give me two sentence answer. I need a more fully developed response covering 1 to 2 paragraphs in order for you to earn full credit. So if you look to page 121 of the 7th edition of our textbook, The Moral of the Story, you will see the first of the 4 major approaches to moral differences. Moral nihilism. So nihilism comes from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. So it is literally nothingism. So nihilism is the view that there is no basis whatsoever for moral standards, that morality is an illusion. There is no universal or objective standard by which you can determine what is good and what is evil. Right? So morality simply doesn't exist. When people speak in moral terms, when people use the terms good and evil, those terms are ultimately meaningless. So morality is, in principle, impossible if nihilism is true. Right? There's no ultimate standard or basis for an ethical life. So this is a very dark place to be in if you are a moral nihilist. All right, it is at one extreme of the spectrum. We'll see at the end what is on the opposite extreme when we get through all 4 of the approaches to moral differences. So nihilism typically accompanies atheism. It's the flip side of atheism, right? Because without God, this is the argument, and you find it in Nietzsche and you find it in Sartre. Without God, there is no basis, there's no cosmic support for morality. And therefore, as Sartre says, quoting Dostoevsky, nothing is true, meaning nothing is morally true. There are no moral truths, no moral universals. And therefore everything is permitted, meaning that from the point of view of the universe, there is no such thing as good and evil. Now, morality, there is such a thing as man-made laws which prohibit certain actions like murder. So, but if you commit murder and do not get caught and punished by the civil authorities, then you've, in a sense, gotten away with murder. From the point of view of the universe, you will have no punishment to suffer if you do not get caught and punished by the civil authorities. And this is if moral nihilism is in fact true. And we hope that it is not. The second moral approach is ethical relativism. Now, relativism is not quite as extreme as nihilism, although it is, we might say it's a distant cousin to nihilism. Relativism states that there is no universal moral truth. It doesn't say that morality is utterly meaningless, but it grounds moral perspectives in a given culture. So whatever the dominant view of good and evil happens to be in a particular culture is the accepted view, and that constitutes the moral compass that governs the people in that society. But relativism argues that there's no transcendent or universal standard of good and bad or good and evil that is applicable in all societies, in all places, at all times. So a relativist, an ethical relativist, will say that what is true in one culture may not be accepted as true in another, or what is accepted as good and right and just in one society or culture may not be accepted as just or good or right in another culture. We simply just have to agree to disagree. Now, soft universalism, the third of the four major approaches to moral differences, is looking for shared beliefs or values among the cultures and societies that exist. So it's looking for commonalities, for common ground, right? As the book says on page 123, under the surface of antagonism and contradiction, when you look at different cultures and how they have conflicting beliefs about morality, the text says we can still find a few things that we agree on, even if we choose to act on them in different ways. So that there can be an argument for the existence of a few universal moral truths that apply in all times, in all places. One example you could give is the prohibition against killing innocent people, the prohibition against murder. That seems to be universal. Now, we may have different ways of punishing murderers. In Sweden, they get life in prison. In Texas, where I live, many of them get the death penalty. One can make a very compelling case that there are that the prohibition against theft is universal, although different societies go about punishing thieves differently. We give them a stiff fine or a small jail sentence. In Saudi Arabia, you get your hands cut off. So among soft universalists, one might be able to argue that Plato and Aristotle would fit in that category, since their understanding of human virtue is based on some notion of human nature, right? Which is unchanging, which is universal, right? A human being in China is ultimately the same as a human being in the United States in terms of the makeups of our soul, right? Plato argues that the soul is made up of three faculties or functions, namely reason, spiritedness, and appetite or desire. And that is no less true for someone living in ancient Greece as it is for someone living in 21st century America. Right, and there are certain common features that bind all humans together, and that one may be able to come up with a universal standard of morality that applies in all times and all places. Now, coming to the last of the four approaches to moral differences is hard universalism, and this is at the furthest extreme from the one we began with, namely moral nihilism. So, whereas nihilism claims that there is no such thing as morality in any meaningful sense, there is no basis for it. The world is a cold and indifferent and amoral place. On the contrary, for hard universalism, there are indeed moral standards that are absolute and eternal and objective. One example you could give would be the Ten Commandments found in the Old Testament, or in the Torah, if you are of the Jewish faith. The Ten Commandments are absolute in the sense that they do not change, right? That thou shalt worship no other God before me. That is not meant to be changeable from place to place. It is eternal. That is simply the truth. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Those are commandments that come straight from the mouth of God, and therefore they are universally binding. They do not change. They don't depend on whether we agree with them or not. They simply exist and are binding, and whether we choose to agree with them or not, we will be held to account if we break any of those commandments. So they are absolute in that sense. Now, as to which one comes closest to your own viewpoint, of course, that is a personal matter, and it is entirely up to you to articulate and explain why you chose one over the others. Now, let us turn now to the second question. Discuss Ruth Benedict's claim that what is normal for a culture is what is moral in that culture. Discuss the advantages and problems associated with the theory of ethical relativism. So Ruth Benedict was trained as an anthropologist, and her mentor was a pioneer of this idea that different societies have different ethical standards, different cultures have different ethical standards, particularly if you look at non-Western cultures, you'll find radically different moral and social standards than what we have in the West. And he concluded from that fact, and Ruth Benedict followed along with his conclusion, that to quote from the question, that what is normal for a culture is what is moral in that culture. Namely, that morality is defined by the dominant perspectives within a culture. And therefore, that different cultures will have different standards of morality, different ways of approaching the question, what is good and what is bad. So this is known as cultural relativism. So again, if you look at Saudi Arabia, let's just use an extreme an example that is very much opposed, very much very different from what we have in the United States. In Saudi Arabia, right, if you commit adultery, that is punishable by death. If you commit apostasy, which is the abandonment of your religious faith, in particular Islam, that is a crime that is punishable by death as well. So that is considered normal and therefore moral, right? So people who abandon their faith should be put to death. People who cheat on their spouses should be put to death, right? Whereas in the Western society, especially postmodern Western society like ours, such things are not considered to be extreme enough to be punishable by death. In fact, the United States is if not the last of the Western countries to hold on to the death penalty, one of the very few that are left. So in most of the Western industrialized nations, adultery is not a punishable crime. Apostasy is not a punishable crime, right? And that is considered normal for us. That is considered moral, to give people the freedom to live, to enjoy their personal freedoms as they choose, so long as they do not violate anyone else's rights. So you have different standards of right and wrong in different cultures, right? That's and therefore that there is no transcendent or universal standard of right and wrong. Now, when it comes to the advantages and disadvantages, I'm going to let you do your research in the textbook, but two things that stand out immediately that I'll speak about very briefly. In terms of an advantage, I think we can all agree that tolerance of different cultural traditions is a good thing, right? Relativism is the theoretical foundation for the culture of tolerance, mutual respect, right? That's how people of vastly different cultural belief systems can live harmoniously, or at least can avoid harming one another. That seems to be a good thing. Of course, we can all agree. A majority of Americans in 2015 believe that gay marriage should be a right. Just 10 years ago, that was not the case. Probably even 5 years ago, that was not the case. But it is now, right? 60 years ago, there were laws against miscegenation in the South, which is the intermarriage of people of different races. That was illegal. We've become way more tolerant now than in the past because we've embraced more and more this relativistic understanding of ethics. And in that sense, one can argue that that is a good thing. But what are some of the problems? Well, if you look at page 129 and following in the textbook, you can see a number of problems. For one thing, you can't criticize another culture. If you truly embrace the ideology of cultural relativism, you forfeit your right to criticize any other culture. So if you happen to be someone who believes in fundamental equality between women and men, equality before the law, for example, if you happen to believe that is a fundamental right, that a woman should be able to vote, to marry whomever she wants, to own property, to drive a car, then there are certain cultures in the world that you would rightly want to criticize because they do not afford women those rights. But as a cultural relativist, you would have no grounds on which to do so, because as a cultural relativist, you would have to deny that there is any universal, transcendent, objective standard that says that women deserve equal treatment to men. To criticize other cultures who deny women those rights that you feel so passionate about would be to impose your own Western feminist ideology onto foreign cultures who have never been exposed to it and who don't subscribe to it. It would be a kind of cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism is exactly what one of the things that relativism seeks to undermine. Okay, well, let's move on to chapter 10. All right, so Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist philosopher, believes that being ethical is not the ultimate ideal mode of existence. One must also have religious faith. Explore this viewpoint. What does he think faith can give that ethics cannot? Do you agree? Can we be ethical without faith? Can we have religious faith without ethics? Explain. This is a tough question, a rather long one. And the textbook does not go into as much detail as I would like. But let's just do what we can, all right? So Kierkegaard talks about 3 stages of life. And I'm going to go through each one. The aesthetic stage. That is the first stage and the lowest of the 3. The aesthetic stage involves, typically everyone goes through this stage when they're young, and most of us move on to the next stage or the next 2 stages because we mature and we become more serious about life and about living well and not just about having a good time. And although some people tragically remain in the aesthetic stage, for the rest of their lives. So the aesthetic stage is when you are consumed with the pursuit of amusement, sensuous pleasure, fun, partying. That's on the low level, right? But even on the higher level, people who enjoy going to the theater, who love to look at art, who love beauty, who love beautiful sounds and images, and who seek pleasure of a more refined kind, good food and wine, what John Stuart Mill calls the higher pleasures, right? People who are consumed with pleasure, whether it's gross sensual pleasure or even higher, more refined pleasure. These are the ones who are living in the aesthetic stage. They want variety and novelty. They want excitement. But what is missing, according to Kierkegaard, in the aesthetic stage is any commitment to a universal ethical standard. So people in the aesthetic stage are not really concerned with ethics. They're not concerned with the kinds of obligations they have to others. They're not morally serious. They're more concerned with being amused and having fun. And Kierkegaard argues that eventually those who are in the aesthetic stage will start to experience this sense of despair, a kind of sadness or melancholy. They will realize that they are not really satisfied with this life. It's not giving them what they're really looking for. And at that point, they're faced with two alternatives. Either they can remain in despair on the aesthetic level, or they must make the transition to the next level by an act of choice, by self-commitment. And that next level is known as the ethical stage. So at the ethical stage, a human being accepts certain determinate moral standards and obligations, whatever they may be. One accepts that there is an ethical standard to life, and they embrace it. They choose it. So they abandon the life of consequence-free fun and pleasure and enter the life of moral serious, where they commit themselves to living according to a moral code. So one example Kierkegaard gives, it's not in your textbook, I don't think it is, but I'm using one of his own books written by Kierkegaard. He uses Don Juan, the famous seducer, as an example of someone who's in the aesthetic stage, looking for pleasure and fun without commitment. And once one makes the transition to the ethical stage, from the aesthetic to the ethical stage, then the man who renounces the satisfaction of his sexual appetite according to passive attractions and enters into the state of marriage, and thereby accepting all of marriage's obligations, that is an example of the transition from the aesthetic to the ethical stage. So again, the ethical stage is defined by the acceptance of a moral code, a rational moral code. Socrates would be another example of someone who lives in the ethical stage and who's willing. Socrates, he's a kind of tragic hero in the sense that he dies for his ethical principle, right? For his belief that philosophy as a way of life is the greatest way of life, and that it makes the lives of everyone better because it allows them to search for the good, to ask the right questions, to separate what is true from what is false, and so forth. And he dies for that commitment to that ethical ideal, because the city of Athens puts him to death for corrupting the youth. Right? He's seen as a bad influence on the youth, when in fact he was one of the greatest human beings that ever lived. Now, the last stage is the religious stage, or faith, embracing Christian faith, because Kierkegaard is a Christian, a Protestant. And the problem with the ethical stage, the reason why it's not enough, is that, according to Kierkegaard, eventually one comes to discover, the person in the ethical stage comes to discover that it really isn't possible to achieve perfection, moral perfection, for a human being to achieve moral perfection. It's just not possible. We keep on making lapses. We keep on messing up. We just can't seem to attain perfect virtue of the kind that Aristotle talks about, or Plato. We always fall short of that ideal. And one comes to the realization that the reason why we cannot become morally self-sufficient, the reason why we cannot become morally perfect on our own, through our own efforts, through our own determination, is, according to Kierkegaard, because we are sinful creatures. We are born sinful, imperfect creatures, and therefore we can only become perfect through believing in God and receiving His grace and receiving salvation and eternal life. And that can only happen by making this leap of faith, right? So that is the religious stage, is when you recognize, according to Kierkegaard, that ethics is not, it's necessary but not sufficient. It is a transition stage towards the life of faith, which requires a leap of faith, right? And what do we mean by leap of faith? Well, Kierkegaard argues that faith is not something that's based on reason. There's no proof. There's not enough proof in the world to suffice for you to make the leap of faith, to embrace Christianity. That's Kierkegaard's view. Now, other Christians might disagree, but for Kierkegaard, there is not enough objective, fact-based evidence that will suffice to convince us to make the acceptance of Christianity, to make that transition out of the ethical stage. We have to, in a sense, make this leap. It's uncertain, right? He calls it an objective uncertainty. Faith is an adventure, a risk, right? It is not a certainty, and it's a risk and a venture that we constantly renew every day of our lives. But it is what is necessary. Having that relationship with God is the only way that we can live complete, full lives. All right, so let's turn to the last question for chapter 10. Explain Nietzsche's theory of master morality versus slave morality and his concept of the overman. What, in your view, are the positive aspects of that theory, and what are the negative aspects, if any? Okay, so master morality and slave morality, this is Nietzsche's, one of his great contributions to the whole philosophy, the discipline of ethics. He's a very controversial figure. You might have noticed in the readings that his philosophy was very influential with the Nazis. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but let me just quickly say that if you just do a little bit of research, you'll see that Nietzsche was taken out of context by the Nazis, and Nietzsche himself would not have been sympathetic to Nazism or the Holocaust or any of the horrors committed by Hitler. There are a number of reasons to support that view. But in any case, master morality for Nietzsche is divided up into two categories, or two moral terms, good and bad. So good represents the aristocratic qualities, the noble qualities that Nietzsche admires in the ancient Greeks, for example, in the samurai culture in Japan, in the Vikings, in the Germanic tribes that sacked Rome, in all of the great cultures that precede the modern era, that precede Christianity, in fact. So in master morality, good represents all of these noble qualities that make human beings and that make cultures great. So manly self-assertion, ambition, strength, self-mastery, right? Being, having complete self-control and self-discipline is a sign of great strength and nobility, because it's so difficult to pull off. And that is a quality that Nietzsche associates with good under master morality, right? Self-confidence, the pursuit of excellence. Now, the qualities that are designated as bad under master morality are basically the absence of all of the good qualities, or the opposite of all of the good qualities. So you're looking at timidity, spinelessness, cowardice, weakness in all its forms, resentment, right? The feeling of kind of jealousy and hatred towards those who possess greatness, the greatness that the slave lacks. So yeah, essentially all of the opposite qualities of what is considered good in master morality would be designated as bad in slave morality, or in master morality. So good and bad. Just know that it's good and bad in master morality. Nobility versus weakness. Now in slave morality, what you have is an inversion of the qualities that exist in master morality. So in slave morality, you have good and evil. Good and evil. So the slave morality is basically the product of the creation of what Nietzsche calls the slaves, the slavish types of human beings that have always existed, still exist, and shall continue to exist. Now, what makes a slave is all of the bad qualities in master morality. Again, so spineless people, cowardly people, weak people, people who cannot endure hardship or suffering, people who are jealous and resentful of their superiors. You get the drift, right? So according to Nietzsche, in slave morality, the slavish types invent a new morality according to which all of the qualities of the slaves are now elevated to the status of good, and all of the qualities of the masters, of the noble aristocratic types, are denigrated or downgraded to the status of evil. So under slave morality, who are the good guys? Who are the good people? The nice guy, the sensitive guy, the one who is who never gives offense, who is meek and tolerant and accepting. Basically, all of the kind of politically correct virtues of our own time, I think Nietzsche would see as examples of slave morality, of what is considered good in a slave morality. Okay. Nietzsche criticizes Christianity for promoting these kinds of slavish values. He's very much a critic of Christianity on these grounds, right? Turn the other cheek is not a notion that a noble aristocratic type would subscribe to, right? Alexander the Great would not subscribe to turning the other cheek. Achilles, right, or King Leonidas of Sparta would not subscribe to the view that the meek shall inherit the earth, or that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. For each of these notions are catastrophic in what they do to the human soul, right? They turn us into these spineless, cowardly slaves. Again, that's Nietzsche's view. That is Nietzsche's view. Now, the concept of the overman, for Nietzsche, the overman is basically the good man of master morality, the one who, out of a superabundance of strength and power, determines for himself or herself what constitutes good and bad. The overman is the one who is curiously, conspicuously missing from the postmodern age, according to Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes in the mid to late 1800s, and he's already diagnosing the problem in Germany and elsewhere throughout Europe, that that the modern Western world has been overrun by a slave morality, and we are in need of an overman or a group of overmen to redeem Western civilization, to bring it back to its faded glory by reasserting a master morality according to which greatness and strength and ambition and the willingness to fight and exploit and conquer will find a resurgence, and Europe will be great again. Now, whether that's just wishful thinking or not is a matter for debate. Whether Nietzsche's philosophy is beneficial or harmful, or whether one should agree with it or not, again, is a matter of debate. And I will leave that the second portion of the question in terms of the positive aspects of the theory and the negative ones, I'll leave that to you. But just be able to articulate and to defend your position either way. There is no right or wrong answer to the questions about what you think, right? But there are good and bad answers. A good answer is one that is clearly articulated with references to the text and defended. That's the crucial part, is defended, right? Don't just tell me you agree that the concept of the Oberman is good. Tell me why you agree, and tell me why in the form of an argument, right? Defend it, sell it to me. And if you disagree with it, do the same thing. Tell me why you disagree in the form of an argument. Defend it, right? Explain to me why I should agree with you. And that's how you get full points. Alrighty then, well, that concludes our review for our final test, covering chapters 3 and 10. I wish you the best of luck. And if you have any questions, be sure to shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much and have a good one.